Wealthy woman insults waitress, but freezes when she sees who owns the restaurant. It was an overcast Friday afternoon when Eleanor Lexington, a name synonymous with old money and prestige in the city, waltzed into the Golden Apron, a cozy, modest restaurant tucked away on a cobblestone street. Eleanor's world was one of glittering galas, champagne-soaked evenings, and exclusive country clubs. She wasn't accustomed to dining in places like this, and it showed. The Golden Apron wasn't ordinary, though. Locals knew it as a beacon of warmth, a place where the staff treated everyone like family, and the food carried the taste of stories passed down through generations. But Eleanor didn't care about any of that. She'd arrived reluctantly after her assistant had assured her the restaurant served the best truffle risotto in town. Dressed in her tailored designer coat and carrying a handbag that cost more than the average family's yearly income, Eleanor stepped inside with an air of superiority. She surveyed the quaint surroundings with a barely concealed sneer. Her sharp heels clicked against the wooden floor, drawing the attention of a waitress standing nearby. "Good afternoon," the waitress greeted with a smile, her voice warm despite the wealthy woman's icy demeanor. Her name tag read Sophia, and her uniform was neat, though it bore the inevitable signs of a long shift. Sophia's kind hazel eyes met Eleanor's gaze. "I'd like a table by the window," Eleanor said curtly, not bothering with a greeting in return. She waved a manicured hand dismissively. "Preferably one that's clean. This establishment could use a bit more polish, don't you think?" Sophia's smile faltered for a brief second before she regained her composure. "Of course, ma'am. Right this way." Eleanor followed her to the corner table by the window, but not without pausing to inspect the chair for dust before sitting down. Her demeanor suggested she was doing Sophia and the restaurant a favor by gracing them with her presence. Sophia handed her a menu. "Our specials are listed on the—" "I'll skip the pleasantries, thank you," Eleanor interrupted. "Just bring me a sparkling water and the truffle risotto. And make sure it's hot. I hate lukewarm food." "Right away, ma'am," Sophia replied, her tone still courteous despite the slight tremor in her voice. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, her shoulders just a touch more tense. Eleanor barely noticed the waitress retreating. She was busy pulling out her phone, her fingers dancing over the screen as she scrolled through emails. She didn't see the quiet hum of activity around her, the clinking of plates, the soft chatter of other diners, or the loving care with which the staff tended to their customers. When the food finally arrived, Eleanor didn't look up from her phone. "Took you long enough," she muttered as Sophia placed the plate in front of her. "My apologies," Sophia replied softly, standing for a moment to ensure everything was in order. Eleanor finally glanced at the plate, her brow furrowing. "Is this supposed to be acceptable?" she asked sharply. "The presentation is uninspired. And these portions, are you feeding children here?" Sophia's face flushed, but she kept her composure. "I'll inform the chef of your concerns." "See that you do," Eleanor snapped. She pushed the plate slightly away as if it offended her. The moment lingered awkwardly before Sophia walked away. Nearby diners exchanged glances but said nothing. Eleanor, unbothered by the tension she created, leaned back in her chair and resumed scrolling through her phone. But then, something happened that made her stop in her tracks. The door to the kitchen swung open, and out stepped a figure Eleanor would never have expected to see. The woman who emerged wore a simple chef's jacket, her hair neatly tied back. But it wasn't her attire that made Eleanor freeze. It was her face. The woman who stepped out from the kitchen carried an air of authority and grace. Her presence was commanding yet approachable, the kind that turned heads without effort. Eleanor's blood ran cold as recognition dawned upon her. Standing before her, dressed as the head chef and owner of this humble restaurant, was none other than Margaret Maggie Hartwell, the daughter of the former housekeeper who had worked for Eleanor's family years ago. The same Maggie that Eleanor, as a younger woman, had dismissed as the help, a girl she had barely acknowledged except to criticize or belittle. Maggie's eyes briefly scanned the room, her expression one of quiet confidence. Then, her gaze landed on Eleanor. For a fleeting moment, her calm demeanor faltered, a flash of surprise crossing her face. But just as quickly, she recovered, her lips curving into a polite smile. Eleanor's heart raced. What was Maggie doing here? Owning this place? Eleanor had barely given her a second thought after Maggie's family left their employment under less than amicable circumstances. How was it possible that this girl, this nobody, had become someone? Maggie approached Eleanor's table with measured steps, her smile unwavering but her eyes sharp, like she was carefully assessing the situation. Sophia trailed behind her, holding her notepad nervously. "Good afternoon," Maggie began, her voice steady and warm, with just a hint of steel underneath. "I'm Margaret Hartwell, the owner and head chef of the Golden Apron. I understand there's a concern about your meal." Eleanor blinked, struggling to find her words. "Maggie," she finally managed, her voice tinged with disbelief. Maggie's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in her eyes, a glimmer of amusement perhaps? "It's been a long time, Eleanor," she said evenly. "I go by Margaret now." Eleanor's cheeks flushed. She wasn't used to being caught off guard, let alone by someone she once considered beneath her notice. She straightened in her chair, grasping for some semblance of control. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Well, life has a way of surprising us," Maggie replied, her tone polite but with an unmistakable edge. "I believe Sophia mentioned there was an issue with your risotto?" Eleanor hesitated, glancing at the plate in front of her. The food itself looked exquisite, a fact she'd been too flustered to notice earlier. The golden hue of the truffle oil glistened under the soft lighting, the dish arranged with meticulous care. She suddenly felt foolish for her earlier complaints but refused to show it. "It's fine," Eleanor said dismissively, her usual haughtiness creeping back into her voice. "I was just expecting something a bit more refined, considering all the praise I've heard about this place." Maggie tilted her head, studying Eleanor for a moment before nodding. "I appreciate the feedback," she said simply. "We strive for excellence here, and I'll personally ensure your experience improves." With that, Maggie turned and walked back toward the kitchen, leaving Eleanor sitting there, her emotions a tangle of embarrassment and indignation. Around her, the other diners resumed their meals, oblivious to the silent storm brewing at her table. For the rest of the meal, Eleanor barely touched her food, though she couldn't deny it was delicious. She kept glancing toward the kitchen, unable to shake the image of Maggie's calm, composed face. Memories she had long buried began to resurface, the way she had treated Maggie as a child, the sharp words and condescending remarks. She had always assumed Maggie's life would amount to nothing. And yet, here she was, a successful entrepreneur, commanding respect in a way Eleanor never imagined. As she left the restaurant that day, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that her encounter with Maggie wasn't over. Something about the interaction stirred a strange, uncomfortable feeling deep inside her, a mixture of shame, curiosity, and, though she hated to admit it, admiration. Eleanor left the Golden Apron in a daze, her mind buzzing with fragmented thoughts. The sound of her heels clicking against the cobblestone felt distant, as if she were moving in a dream. Maggie, Margaret, Hartwell, of all people. The realization refused to settle neatly in her mind. She slid into her sleek black car and gripped the steering wheel tightly, staring at the restaurant's entrance in her rearview mirror. How had Maggie managed to build something so respectable? It didn't make sense. The Maggie Eleanor remembered was shy, awkward, and always too eager to please. The drive back to her estate was a blur. Eleanor's sprawling mansion sat perched on a hill, a testament to generations of wealth and privilege. As she stepped inside, the silence of the cavernous space felt heavier than usual. She dropped her handbag on the marble table by the entrance and sank into an armchair, letting out a deep sigh. Memories flooded her unbidden. She remembered Maggie as a skinny, wide-eyed teenager, tagging along behind her mother, Clara. Clara had been the Lexington family's housekeeper for nearly a decade, and Eleanor had always taken her presence for granted. Maggie had often helped Clara with chores, dusting shelves, folding laundry, or quietly fetching tea when Eleanor demanded it. Eleanor had never been cruel outright, but she had been dismissive, even mocking at times. She'd teased Maggie for her second-hand clothes, her clumsy demeanor, and her dreams of going to culinary school. Eleanor had found it laughable. "Do you even know how expensive those schools are?" she'd once said with a smirk. "You'd have to cook for a king to afford the tuition." That memory now stung in a way Eleanor hadn't anticipated. The days passed, but Eleanor couldn't shake the encounter. Curiosity gnawed at her, pulling her back to the Golden Apron 1 week later. She told herself it was to give the restaurant a second chance, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. When she walked in, the familiar warmth of the place enveloped her once again. Maggie wasn't visible at first, and Eleanor was led to a table by Sophia, who greeted her with the same kindness as before, though there was a subtle wariness in her eyes. Eleanor couldn't blame her. As Eleanor sipped her water and waited for her meal, Maggie emerged from the kitchen. Their eyes met across the room, and Maggie paused, her expression unreadable. She exchanged a few quiet words with Sophia before approaching Eleanor's table. "Back again?" Maggie asked, her tone light but carrying an undercurrent of surprise. Eleanor smiled faintly, trying to project confidence. "Your risotto was impressive. I thought I'd see what else your menu has to offer." Maggie arched an eyebrow, the corner of her mouth quirking upward. High praise from someone who wasn't thrilled with the presentation last time. Eleanor flushed, but before she could respond, Maggie gestured toward the chair opposite her. "May I sit?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. Maggie pulled out the chair and sat, folding her hands neatly on the table. There was a moment of silence, charged with unspoken history, before Maggie spoke. "You seemed surprised to see me here last time," she said, her tone neutral. "I was," Eleanor admitted, deciding that honesty was the best approach. "The last time I saw you, I never would have imagined this." Maggie smiled faintly. "People change. Circumstances change." Eleanor tilted her head, studying Maggie. "How did you?" "I mean this place. It's impressive." Maggie's gaze softened, and for the first time, Eleanor saw a glimpse of the girl she used to know. "It wasn't easy," Maggie began. "After my mom left your family's service, we struggled. She took on cleaning jobs wherever she could, and I worked part-time while going to community college. Eventually, I saved enough to attend culinary school on a scholarship. From there, it was a lot of long hours, hard work, and some good people who believed in me." Eleanor felt a pang of guilt as Maggie spoke. She remembered how Clara had left their employ after a heated disagreement with Eleanor's father. It hadn't seemed significant at the time, but now she wondered how deeply it had affected them. "I never expected to see you again," Maggie continued, her tone reflective. "But when I recognized you last week, I couldn't help but think about those days at your house." Eleanor shifted uncomfortably. "I imagine they weren't the fondest memories." Maggie shrugged. "They weren't all bad. My mom always said that life was about taking the good with the bad and making something worthwhile out of it. I think that's what I've tried to do here." Eleanor nodded, unsure of how to respond. A part of her wanted to apologize, to acknowledge the ways she had wronged Maggie and her family. But the words caught in her throat, tangled with pride and years of ingrained superiority. "I have to say," Maggie added, a teasing glint in her eye, "I'm surprised you dined somewhere like this. It's a far cry from the country clubs you're used to." Eleanor couldn't help but laugh softly, the tension breaking slightly. "Yes, well, even I can appreciate good food when I find it." Maggie smiled, and for the first time, the warmth in her expression felt genuine. "I'm glad you gave us a second chance." As Maggie stood to leave, Eleanor found herself blurting out, "Maggie, thank you." Maggie paused, her brow furrowing slightly. "For what?" For sharing your story," Eleanor said, fumbling for the right words. "It's inspiring." Maggie studied her for a moment before nodding. "Everyone has a story, Eleanor. It's what we do with it that matters." And with that, she walked away, leaving Eleanor to sit alone, her thoughts swirling with newfound clarity.